Lost in the dark, this happened about 5 years ago when I was driving back from my parents' house in a small town about 3 hours away. It was late, past 10 p.m., and I was on one of those long, empty country roads where you can go miles without seeing another car. My phone had barely any signal, and the GPS had already glitched a few times. I remember thinking I should have left earlier, but I got caught up talking with my mom, and well, here I was alone in the dark on a road that felt like it stretched forever. Then, out of nowhere, a deer shot across the road. I swerved instinctively, and my car skidded on the damn pavement before coming to a rough stop in a ditch. The impact wasn't bad, but when I tried to reverse, the wheels just spun uselessly in the mud. That's when I realized I was stuck. At T first, I wasn't too worried. I turned on my hazard lights and checked my phone. No service. I figured I'd wait a bit. Maybe someone would pass by. The nearest house wasn't far, maybe a 5-minute walk, but it looked dark except for a faint glow from one of the windows. I hesitated. It felt wrong to walk up to a stranger's house so late, but the temperature was dropping, and I didn't have many options. I grabbed my jacket, locked the car, and started walking toward the house. The gravel crunched under my boots, the sound uncomfortably loud in the stillness. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the house was off. The windows were coated in grime. The porch sagged, and the dim light inside flickered like a candle struggling to stay lit. But I was cold, alone, and stranded. I climbed the creaky steps, took a breath, and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, like whoever was inside had been standing right behind it. A woman stood there, barely illuminated by the weak light from inside. She was tall, thin, and wore an old-fashioned nightgown that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was long, dark, and tangled, as if she had just woken up, but her eyes, they were wide open, unblinking, locked onto mine like she was trying to decide something. I started to explain, car accident, no signal, just needed to wait somewhere warm, but she didn't react. No questions, no concern, just this heavy silence stretching between us. Then, without a word, she turned and walked deeper into the house, leaving the door open behind her. I hesitated. Everything in me was telling me to turn around, but the cold wind biting at my skin pushed me forward. Inside, the house smelled damp, like that had soaked up too much rain over the years. The furniture was sparse, just an old couch, a wooden table, and a few mismatched chairs. No pictures on the walls, no decorations, just bare, peeling wallpaper. The dim light came from an oil lamp on the table, its flame barely flickering. Thank you," I said awkwardly, stepping inside and rubbing my arms for warmth. The woman still hadn't spoken. She just pointed down a hallway and started walking, expecting me to follow. The hallway was even darker, the shadows stretching long and deep. Might get twisted, but what was I supposed to do? Go back outside and freeze? So, against every instinct screaming at me, I followed her. She led me to a small room at the end of the hallway. It was almost completely bare, just a narrow bed with a thin, gray blanket, a wooden chair in the corner, and a window covered by a heavy, moth-eaten curtain. The air was stale, carrying a faint, sour smell I couldn't place. She stopped in the doorway, still staring at me with that same vacant expression. "You can stay here," she finally said, her voice dry and brittle, like she hadn't spoken in days. Before I could respond, she stepped back and pulled the door shut. I heard the soft click of a lock. My stomach dropped. I rushed to the door, gripping the handle, but it didn't budge. "Hey," I called out, knocking. No response. "Excuse me, ma'am. I think you locked the door by accident." Silenced, I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe she just wanted privacy, or maybe this was how she kept guests safe in an old house with bad locks. Yeah, that had to be it. I turned toward the window, thinking I could at least look outside, but when I pulled the curtain back, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing out there. No trees, no road, not even my car. Just pure, endless darkness, thick and heavy like a void. I pressed my face closer to the glass, straining my eyes, but it was like looking into ink. My pulse started to race. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my phone, hoping maybe the signal had returned, but the screen wouldn't even turn on. It was fully charged when I left my car. My hand started to tremble that I backed away from the window, my breath coming out in short, shaky bursts. The room felt colder now, like the walls themselves were leaching the warmth from my skin. I knocked on the door again, harder this time. "Hello? Please, I think there's been a mistake." My voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. Then, just as I was about to start banging, I heard its soft, shuffling footsteps just outside the door. Relief flooded through me. "Ma'am, can you open the door?" But she didn't respond. The footsteps just lingered, pacing, stopping, then starting again, slow and deliberate. My skin prickled. It was like she was standing right there, inches away, listening. I swallowed hard and stepped back. "Look, I just need to leave in the morning. I don't want to bother you." Still, no response. Just that eerie, measured pacing. Then something else. A whisper. Faint, almost too soft to hear. At first, I thought it was the woman talking to herself, but the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was inside the room. My body went rigid. I turned my head slowly, afraid to even breathe. The chair in the corner, empty just moments ago, wasn't empty anymore. A shape sat there, barely visible in the dim light. My stomach clenched as the whispering grew louder. Words I couldn't understand, garbled and wet like someone speaking through water. My knees locked, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked. The window led to nothing. And whatever was in that chair, it was getting closer. Stumbled back until my heels hit the bed frame. The whispering twisted into something worse. Ragged, uneven breathing, like lungs filled with liquid. My fingers fumbled for anything, a weapon, a way out, but there was nothing. The shape in the chair shifted. A sickening crack echoed through the room, like bones bending the wrong way. Then a hand, pale and too long, gripped the armrest. My breath hitched. Slowly, impossibly slow, it began to rise. My body refused to move, frozen between fight and flight. My mind screamed to run, but where? My only escape was through the locked door, where that silent woman still stood, listening. Then the breathing stopped. Silence. A silence so complete it rang in my ears. My chest ached from holding my breath. I squeezed my eyes shut for just a second, just one stupid second. And when I opened them, the chair was empty again. My stomach lurched. The door handle rattled violently. Not just a simple jiggle, but like someone or something was trying to tear it open from the other side. My heart slammed against my ribs. A low, guttural whisper seeped through the cracks of the door. Not the woman's voice. Not the thing from the chair. Something else. And it knew my name. I choked on my own breath, my legs finally breaking free from their paralysis. I backed into the corner, my fingers digging into the peeling wallpaper as if I could somehow push through the walls and escape. The door handle jerked again, harder this time, the wood groaning under the strain. I knew, deep in my gut, that if that door opened, I wouldn't be leaving this house. Desperation took over. I grabbed the wooden chair, the same one that had held that thing just moments ago, and I hurled it at the window with all my strength. The glass shattered, shards scattering across the floor, but outside was still nothing. Just a vast, endless void. No ground, no stars, just blackness, but I didn't care. Anything was better than staying in that room. I climbed on the windowsill, bracing myself to jump, even if it meant falling forever. Just as I was about to push off, I heard it, a whisper impossibly close, brushing against my ear like cold breath. "Stay." A hand wrapped around my wrist, fingers thin and ice cold, pulling me back within human strength. I screamed, kicking wildly, my free hand grabbing at the jagged edges of the window frame. The thing behind me let out a wet, rasping laugh. Then, suddenly light. Bright, blinding light flooding the room. The grip on my wrist vanished. The door burst open, and standing there, no longer silent, was the woman, her face twisted in something between fury and fear. She didn't say a word, just stormed toward me, grabbed my arm, and yanked me off the windowsill with surprising strength. I stumbled backward, my heart still hammering in my chest. "You shouldn't have done that," she muttered, her voice low and strained. I barely had time to process before she shoved a heavy metal key into the lock and twisted it violently. The moment the door clicked shut, the entire room seemed to shudder, as if the house itself had taken a deep breath. I opened my mouth to demand answers, to ask what the hell was happening, but she turned on me, eyes burning with something unreadable. "You need to leave," she hissed, grabbing my wrist and dragging me down the dark hallway. I didn't resist. I didn't dare. The house groaned around us, the walls almost pulsing like a living thing. As we reached the front door, I realized the dim, flickering light was no longer coming from the oil lamp. It was coming from the walls themselves, from thin cracks forming along the peeling wallpaper. Something was inside them, pressing against the surface, stretching the fabric of the house like skin over bone. The woman flung the front door open, and for the first time since I arrived, I saw the world outside. The void was gone. The road was back. My car, muddy but intact, sat right where I'd left it. I turned to look at her, 1,000 questions on my tongue, but she shoved me forward with enough force to make me stumble. "Run," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising sound of something shifting inside the walls. I didn't hesitate. I ran. My boots pounded against the gravel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back, even when I heard the door slam shut behind me. Even when I heard the first deep, guttural sound rise from inside the house. I practically threw myself into my car, my hands shaking so badly that I struggled to get the keys in the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I hit the gas without thinking, speeding down that dark, empty road like the devil himself was on my heels. The house shrank in my rearview mirror, its dim light flickering one last time before vanishing into the night that I drove for miles before I finally stopped, pulling into a gas station on the edge of town. My hands were still trembling as I stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. I pulled out my phone, expecting the battery to be dead, but it lit up instantly. Full charge, signal strong. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, about what happened, but where would I even start? Who would believe me? Taking a deep breath, I turned back toward the road. There was no sign of the house in the distance, no flickering light, just darkness and empty fields. To this day, I have no idea where I was that night. No record of that house exists on any map. But sometimes when I'm driving alone on a quiet road, I swear I see a faint glow in the distance and I press the gas a little harder. The Silent Neighbor. I moved into this apartment about a year ago. It's a small one-bedroom unit in a quiet suburban neighborhood. One of those places where nothing ever really happens. Most of my neighbors are older, retired, and keep to themselves. There's this one woman, Mrs. Callahan, who lives right next door. She's in her late 70s, maybe even older, and I barely ever see her. Sometimes I hear her TV through the walls late at night, and once in a while, she leaves a plate of cookies at my door with a little note that just says, "Enjoy." That's the extent of our relationship. She's nice but distant, the kind of person who's just there. The night this happened, there was a storm. A bad one. The kind where the wind howls so loud it sounds like a train is coming through the street. The power goes out of my apartment all the time when it storms, so I wasn't surprised when everything suddenly went dark. My phone was at 12% and the Wi-Fi was out, so I figured I'd just call my parents real quick to let them know. But no signal. I tried a few neighbors, nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked outside. The entire street was pitch black, except for one window. Mrs. Callahan's apartment was still glowing with this soft, yellow light that tea first. I felt relieved. Maybe she had a backup generator or something. But then I started to worry. She was old, lived alone, and if the power had gone out everywhere except her place, maybe something was wrong. Maybe she didn't even realize what was happening. So I grabbed my hoodie, put on my slippers, and headed over. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but thunder still rumbled in the distance. I knocked on her door, lightly at first, then harder when there was no response. "Mrs. Callahan?" I called. Silence. I tried again. Nothing. A weird feeling settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I hesitated before reaching for the doorknob. It was unlocked. I don't know why, but that made me even more nervous. I pushed the door open just a little and peered inside. Dark. Completely dark. But I had just seen the light on seconds ago. I stepped in cautiously, shining my flashlight around. Her furniture was neatly arranged, everything in its place, but the air inside felt off. Stale almost, like the place had been abandoned for years. That was when the door slammed shut behind me, hard enough to rattle the walls. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could move, I heard it faint, deliberate footsteps coming from upstairs. For a second, I couldn't move. My body just froze like my brain hadn't caught up to what was happening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was taking their time. I swallowed hard, telling myself it had to be Mrs. Callahan. Maybe she hadn't heard me knocking. Maybe she was just coming down to see who had entered. But something about the way those footsteps sounded, too light, too careful, made my skin crawl. I turned back to the door, gripping the knob with sweaty fingers, but it wouldn't budge. I twisted harder. Locked. From the inside. My stomach dropped. That didn't make sense and why flashlight flickered. and my breath came out in short, panicked gasps. "Mrs. Callahan?" I called again, my voice shaking. No answer, just more footsteps moving closer to the top of the stairs. I forced myself to think. If she was up there, I needed to let her know I was here. Maybe she needed help. I inched forward, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air was thick, heavy, like the whole apartment was pressing down on me. And then, as I took another step, I heard something that turned my blood to ice. Another set of footsteps directly behind me that I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the living room, silent and still, exactly as it had been when I stepped in. My pulse was a hammer against my ribs. I wasn't imagining it. I had heard those footsteps right behind me. I backed up slowly, keeping the light in front of me, my breath shaky. The apartment felt wrong, like the air was too thick, too still, like it was holding its breath along with me. And then, from upstairs, something shifted. A soft creak, like someone adjusting their weight on an old wooden floor that I wanted to run. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out, to find another way, to do anything but stay there. But my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I whispered, "Mrs. Callahan?" One last time, my voice barely more than a breath. And then, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, came the response. A voice, hoarse and strained, like it hadn't been used in years. "She's not here." My whole body locked up. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I couldn't tell where the voice had come from, but I knew one thing for sure. Whoever said it wasn't Mrs. Callahan, I don't remember making the decision to run. I just did. My body took over before my brain could process anything. I bolted for the door, yanking at the handle with everything I had. Still locked. My fingers fumbled for the deadbolt, but there wasn't one. Just a smooth, cold surface where it should have been. My breathing turned ragged. That wasn't possible. I had just walked through this door. It had a lock. I knew it did. Behind me, the floor creaked again. Slow, deliberate steps moving down the stairs. I turned, my flashlight flickering, the beam bouncing against the walls. A shadow moved at the top of the staircase that I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out anything more than a tall, hunched figure, just standing there, watching. My entire body screamed to me to do something, but I was frozen. Then the figure moved fast. Too fast. 1 second, it was at the top of the stairs, the next halfway down. I stumbled back, slamming into the door so hard my head snapped back. My flashlight blinked out completely. I gasped, swallowing a scream, my hands clawing at the door, desperate. The air grew colder, thick with something I couldn't name, and then I felt it. Fingers cold and bony, wrapping around my wrist that I screamed and yanked my arm back, stumbling away from the door. My wrist burned where it had grabbed me, like the cold had sunk deep into my skin. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the room was pitch black now. No light from outside, no glow from the hallway, just darkness, thick and suffocating. Then I heard it again, that same hoarse voice, whispering, but closer this time. "You shouldn't be here." My stomach twisted violently. I pressed myself against the wall, my hands shaking so hard I could barely breathe. Then something shifted in the dark, inches from my face, that sharp, raspy inhale like something was smelling me. I clenched my jaw to keep from making a sound. My body screamed to run, to fight, to do anything, but I was frozen. And then light, a sudden blinding flash. The lamp in the corner flickered on, and just like that, the room was empty. No figure, no footsteps, nothing. My flashlight flickered back to life in my hand, the beam shaky as I swept it over the room. The door, once locked, now hung slightly open, swaying as if it had never been shut at all. My legs nearly gave out. I didn't wait to question it. I bolted. I stumbled out into the rain, barely registering the cold as I sprinted back to my apartment. My hand was still trembling when I fumbled with my keys, slamming the door behind me and locking it twice. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I stood there for what felt like forever, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. Eventually, I forced myself to look at my wrist. A deep, red mark, like fingers had pressed into my skin with inhuman strength. It throbbed ice cold to the touch. I sat on the floor, staring at it, my mind refusing to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I barely slept. As soon as the sun came up, I forced myself to check next door. The apartment was empty, completely. No furniture, no pictures, nothing. Like no one had lived there in years. I asked the landlord about Mrs. Callahan, my voice still shaking. He gave me a confused look. "That unit's been vacant since last winter," he said. "The last tenant, an older woman, passed away months ago." My stomach twisted. I didn't argue. I just nodded and walked away, my wrist still aching with that ice-cold grip. I don't know who or what was in that apartment that night, and I don't think I ever want to find out. Unexpected visitor during a storm. I remember that night so vividly it makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. It was late October, a Wednesday, I think. I had just gotten home from work, exhausted, and was looking forward to a quiet evening alone. My apartment was small, just a one-bedroom on the third floor of an old building. The kind of place where the walls creaked when the wind hit just right. That night, there was a storm rolling in, and I could hear the rain tapping against my window like impatient fingers. I had just settled on my couch with a beer and some random show playing in the background when, without warning, the power went out. Everything went dead. The TV, the lights, even a street lamp outside my window. Just pure, suffocating darkness. At first, I didn't think much of it. Storms like this always messed with the power in my building. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and decided to check the breaker box in the kitchen. But just as I was about to stand up, there was a loud, sharp knock on my door. It wasn't a casual knock. It was urgent, almost frantic, like someone needed help. My first thought was maybe it was one of my neighbors or even the landlord checking in. But when I got to the door and looked through the peephole, there was no one there. Just the dim outline of the hallway, flickering weakly under the emergency lighting. My stomach tightened. I hesitated for a second before unlocking the door and opening it just a crack. That's when I saw them. Muddy footprints, fresh and wet, trailing away from my door and disappearing around the corner of the hall. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at those footprints. They weren't there when I got home. I was sure of it. Someone had been standing at my door just seconds ago, knocking like their life depended on it. But now, nothing. The hallway was eerily silent, except for the distant hum of rain against the building. I considered calling out, asking if someone needed help, but something in my gut told me to keep my mouth shut. Instead, I slowly closed the door, turning the lock as quietly as I could. That's when I noticed it, my coffee table. The remote that had been sitting next to my beer was gone. My heart pounded as my eyes darted around the room. A book I had left on the armrest of the couch was now on the floor. A drawer in the kitchen, slightly open. Someone had been inside. That I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I had knocked the book over earlier and just didn't notice. Maybe I left the drawer open. But then my gaze landed on the closet door in my bedroom. It was open just an inch or two, enough to see the darkness inside. I never left my closet open, ever. My breath caught in my throat, and my fingers trembled as I reached for my phone. With shaky hands, I dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone had been in my apartment. Maybe they still were. As I spoke, I pressed my back against the wall, my ears straining for any sound. That's when I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps just outside my door. Then, in the silence, a voice, low, breathy, saying my name that I froze. My name, spoken so softly it was almost a sigh, yet it cut through the silence like a knife. I had no idea who it belonged to, but the way they said it made my skin prickle like they weren't just calling for me. They were savoring it. My grip tightened around my phone as the dispatcher kept talking, asking if I was still there. I couldn't answer. I was too focused on the slow, deliberate movement outside my door. The footsteps didn't sound hurried or nervous. Whoever was out there wasn't afraid of being caught. They were waiting, listening. And then, just as suddenly as they came, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I strained to hear any sign of movement, but all I could make out was the storm outside. Then, as if to confirm my worst fear, the doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like someone trying to force their way in. It was slow, testing, like they were letting me know they could come in if they wanted to. My breath came out in short, shallow gasps as I pressed myself harder against the wall, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they could hear it. The dispatcher was still on the line, her voice distant, telling me officers were on the way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was outside wasn't planning on waiting for them to arrive, that I needed to do something. Just sitting there, waiting, wasn't an option. Moving as quietly as I could, I grabbed the heaviest thing near me, a glass bottle from the kitchen counter. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My fingers were slick with sweat as I clutched it, my eyes never leaving the door. Then out of nowhere, 3 knocks. Slow, even, like a metronome keeping time. I nearly dropped the bottle. They weren't panicked like before. These knocks were patient, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side was enjoying this. Then, as if that wasn't horrifying enough, my phone buzzed in my hand with a text from an unknown number. Just 2 words, "Look outside." My stomach dropped. Every part of me screamed, "Don't do it," but some terrible, morbid part of my brain needed to know. Moving like I was in a dream, I turned my head toward the window. At first, all I saw was the reflection of my apartment against the glass, the dim emergency lights casting everything in an eerie glow. But then, movement. Just beyond the edge of my vision, a shadow shifted. It was faint, barely there, but unmistakable. Someone was outside, watching. My breath hitched as I forced myself to look closer, my pulse roaring in my ears. The storm made it hard to see, the rain streaking the glass in frantic, uneven lines. But then, a flash of lightning. For less than a second, the world outside was illuminated, and I saw it. A figure standing across the street, just beyond the glow of a flickering street lamp. They weren't moving, weren't trying to hide, just standing there, staring up at my window. My stomach clenched as I took an unsteady step back. Whoever they were, they knew I had seen them. That was the point. Before I could react, another knock came, louder this time. I whipped my head back toward the door, my mind racing. Whoever was outside my door and whoever was on the street, they weren't the same person. My body went cold. This wasn't just some random break-in or a cruel prank. There were at least 2 of them, maybe more. The thought made my legs weak. I gripped the bottle tighter, trying to think. The police were on their way, but what if they didn't get here in time? What if a sudden noise cut through my thoughts, a soft creak from inside the apartment? Not from the door, from behind me. My whole body locked up as my eyes darted toward the bedroom. The closet. The door was open wider than before. Barely an inch, but enough for me to know, without a doubt, that I hadn't imagined it. My hands shook as I raised the bottle, my breaths coming out in short, panicked bursts. Someone was inside. They had been inside this whole time. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had locked the bedroom window earlier, if I had checked under the bed, if I had been alone at all since the lights went out. I took a slow step back, my feet barely making a sound against the floor. I needed to get out, get to the hallway, find someone, anyone, before it was too late. But as I turned toward the front door, my phone buzzed again. Another text, same unknown number. "Don't run." My breath caught in my throat. The knocks on the door. The figure outside. The closet. They weren't just watching me. They were playing with me that I couldn't breathe. My hands felt numb, my vision tunneling as I tried to process what was happening. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I turned slowly, inch by inch, toward the closet. The gap in the door was just wide enough to swallow the light from the emergency bulbs in the hall, leaving only a void of pure blackness. I knew someone was in there. I felt them. And yet, a sickening part of me needed to see, needed to know. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I lifted my phone and aimed the flashlight at the opening. The beam of light hit the inside of the closet, illuminating clothes hanging limply on their hangers. Nothing moved. For a split second, I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe I imagined it. But then, my light shifted downward, catching something at the very bottom of the closet. Shoes, but not mine. A pair of filthy, mud-caked boots. And inside them, ankles. Someone was standing there, pressed against the wall, just inches away, watching me through the crack in the door.